The air was sharp that morning, the kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting to hear the next move. My sisters had come over unannounced, their SUV still ticking from the drive up the mountain road. I should have known what was coming. Their smiles were too polite, the kind that meant trouble disguised as affection. We sat around my kitchen island, sunlight spilling across the granite, and I waited for one of them to say it. "We were thinking," Melissa started, tapping her manicured nails against her phone. "Since you barely use the lake house, maybe we could list it for short-term rentals, just for a few weekends. It'd help everyone." "Everyone?" I asked, though I already knew what she meant. Kara leaned in, voice sugary. "You wouldn't have to lift a finger. We'll manage everything, split the profit 3 ways. You'll thank us later." I laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. The same tone they'd used for years whenever they wanted something that wasn't theirs. The same charm that had cost me thousands before I learned that generosity without limits isn't kindness, it's surrender. "I'm not renting the house," I said, my voice steady. The silence that followed was small but heavy. Melissa's expression snapped first, her smile collapsing into something sharper. "Why not? You don't even live there full-time. Dad meant for it to be ours." "No," I said quietly. "He left it to me, and it's staying that way." Their eyes met, a silent alliance forming in front of me. Kara muttered something about how I'd changed. Maybe I had. Maybe refusing to be used counts as change. They stood, their coats brushing against the counter. Melissa turned at the door. "You know, people are starting to notice how selfish you've become. It's sad." When the door closed behind them, the silence that returned felt cleaner somehow, like the house itself had exhaled. I walked to the counter where an envelope still lay from the night before. Inside, it was the property deed. My name printed clearly, my father's signature in fatting ink beneath. Proof of what I already knew but would need again soon. I pressed the envelope flat, slid it into a drawer, and whispered to the empty room, "Not this time." For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty for saying no. I felt something else, relief. A calm that came not from pleasing others but from finally protecting myself. Still, I knew my sisters well enough to realize this wasn't over. Entitlement doesn't die quietly, it just regroups. Outside, their SUV reversed down the drive, taillights flashing red like an unspoken warning. I watched until the sound faded into the trees. The lake glimmered in the distance, still and cold. It would be weeks before I saw them again, but when I did, there'd be no arguments left, only facts. It's strange how family roles are written long before anyone realizes they're playing a part. I was always the responsible one. The label followed me through childhood like a badge I hadn't asked for. When our parents divorced, I was 10 and my sisters were still small enough to cry about who got the bigger slice of cake. I didn't cry. I made sure they ate first. That's how it started, the pattern that would eventually make them believe I existed to fix things for them. Dad used to call me his right hand. He'd hand me envelopes for the power bill, ask me to double-check bank slips before I was even old enough to drive. Meanwhile, Melissa was the performer, the one who could charm her way out of anything. Kara was the dreamer, delicate and dramatic, always too sensitive to handle real responsibility. They were loved for their chaos. I was needed for my order. That's a kind of love too, I suppose, just a tiring one. I remember being 17 and working double shifts at a diner to help Dad cover the lake house repairs after a storm ripped through the roof. He promised, "One day this place will be yours. You're the only one who shows up." I didn't think he meant it literally. I just thought he was grateful. But over time, gratitude became dependence, and dependence turned into expectation. When Mom died, everything shifted again. My sisters leaned into comfort, I leaned into control. Bills, funerals, accounts, each task became my way of coping. I thought being the glue would keep us close. Instead, it taught them I'd never let anything fall apart, no matter how carelessly they treated it. The years blurred together in transfers and temporary loans. I'd cover Melissa's credit card payment one month, Kara's tuition late fee the next, always with the promise they'd pay me back soon. They rarely did. I even have the old bank statements, proof of a lifetime of quiet rescues. They sit in a yellowing folder now, each line a reminder of how small debts grow into entitlement when no one draws a line. I used to think love meant giving without keeping score. Now I see it differently. Love without boundaries becomes servitude. And when you've spent years giving more than you can afford, emotionally, financially, spiritually, the people taking start to believe it's their right. The lake house became the symbol of everything unspoken. Dad and I rebuilt it after the storm. The smell of pine and varnish still reminds me of those weekends. My sisters would visit occasionally, take pictures for social media, then leave their mess for me to clean up. I never complained, just scrubbed and smiled. They called me the caretaker. It was meant affectionately, but it landed like a sentence. After Dad passed, I found his handwritten note tucked inside the will. For all the times you fixed what others broke. That line stayed with me. It wasn't about plumbing or paint, it was about people. When the lawyer read out that the house was mine alone, I remember feeling guilty more than relieved. My sisters cried, angry tears disguised as grief. He didn't mean that, Melissa had said. He just assumed we'd share. I didn't argue then. I was still too afraid of being the bad guy. But guilt is a poor inheritance, and time has a way of burning through illusions. The day they came asking to rent the place out, it was as if years of small betrayals had finally reached their final bill. Every memory, every unpaid debt, every "you're so lucky" from mouths that never worked for it, it all led to that single word: no. Now, as I look back, I realize the power in that first refusal came not from anger, but from history finally catching up to itself. Every time I said yes when I should have said no had built this quiet strength in me. Maybe that's what Dad saw all along: the endurance, the steadiness, the part of me that wouldn't break no matter how much was demanded. I went to bed that night replaying old memories like chapters of a story I'd outgrown. The lake outside shimmered under the moonlight, calm but deep. I thought about Dad's voice, low and certain, "Take care of what's yours," for the first time. I understood he hadn't meant just the house. It started with a group text that lit up my phone at 9:17 p.m. on a Thursday. I was half asleep, lulled by the kind of quiet only the lake can give. My phone buzzed once, then again, then endlessly, a barrage of words that felt more like a demand than a conversation. "Melissa, we talked to a few people today. There's a lot of interest in the house." "Kara, yeah, one of my coworkers knows a rental manager who says it could bring in at least $3,000 a week. That's insane to waste, don't you think?" "Melissa again, will take care of everything. You'll get your cut." I stared at the screen, blinking against the sharp blue glow. My cut! The phrase burned quietly. It wasn't a discussion, it was an announcement, like they'd already decided for me. I typed slowly, my fingers trembling with something between disbelief and exhaustion. "You don't have the right to make arrangements for a property that's not yours. Please stop." Seconds later, Melissa's 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then came back. When her reply finally landed, it hit like a slap. "You wouldn't even have that house without Dad. Don't act like you earned it. It's the family home, not your personal trophy." I just sat there, letting the words breathe in the dark. For a long moment, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. All the unspoken resentments that had been fermenting for years had finally spilled into text form, digital proof of how they truly saw me, a gatekeeper standing in the way of their imagined inheritance. Kara tried to soften it a minute later. "We just want to share the blessings, sis. Don't make this weird." Weird, the word made me laugh, but it wasn't a joyful sound. It was the kind of laugh that comes from realizing the rules have changed, and you're the only one who remembers the old ones. I didn't respond again. I just scrolled back through the thread, rereading every message, then took screenshots, every bubble, every timestamp, every manipulative phrase. I saved them into a folder labeled Lake House, 2023. Outside, rain had started tapping against the window, steady and deliberate, like a metronome for my thoughts. I thought about Dad's handwriting on that will, the one line that gave the property to the child who maintained it. He knew who that was. He had seen the years, the receipts, the sacrifices, but my sisters, they saw only what was convenient. The next morning, I found out they hadn't just talked to someone, they had actually called a local realtor. My neighbor, Mrs. Hill, mentioned casually that 2 lively young women were taking pictures by the dock earlier that day. She assumed I'd hired them. My stomach dropped. That was the moment the insult turned into a violation. It wasn't about family anymore. It was about control, about rewriting reality in their favor. They weren't asking, they were taking. I drove down to the lake house that evening, just to see if they'd left any trace. The key fit the lock fine, but when I opened the door, there was a faint smell of perfume that wasn't mine. A wine glass in the sink. A throw blanket draped over the couch. I stood there for a while, gripping the counter, trying to slow the wave of disbelief that kept rising. For years, I'd thought keeping the peace meant keeping quiet. But as I looked around my father's living room, his chair still facing the water, his old fishing rod propped in the corner, I felt something shift. Silence had protected them, not me, and I wasn't going to protect them anymore. I opened my phone, scrolled to that message thread again, and pressed the Save to Files option. The proof didn't just represent an argument, it represented a boundary drawn in ink and code. I didn't yet know what I'd do with it, but I knew one thing for certain. This wouldn't end with another apology from me. I locked the house, double-checked the windows, and stood for a long moment on the porch. The lake was still except for the ripples from a passing breeze. The air felt different, colder, but cleaner. Maybe that's what truth feels like when you stop running from it. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that doesn't come from sleep. It comes from deciding you're done being naive. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. The rain from the night before had cleared, and light spilled across the surface like a quiet spotlight. It was time to stop reacting and start preparing. The first thing I did was open my file drawer. It's funny how much of your life fits into labeled folders: old tax forms, insurance payments, utility receipts. I found the one marked Lake House and pulled everything out. Mortgage statements, maintenance invoices, property tax bills, each one with my name, my account, my effort printed plainly in black and white. Every page was proof of years no one else had seen, years spent fixing what others ignored. I laid them out across the table like puzzle pieces of truth. Then I found it, the will. My father's signature at the bottom, firm even in the final months when his hands had started to shake. There it was, the line that silenced every doubt. To my daughter who maintained the home, paid its taxes, and kept it standing, I leave the lake property in full. I remember reading that sentence for the first time after the funeral, feeling guilt instead of gratitude. But now, it felt like armor. I took photos of each page, careful to capture the official seals and signatures. I scanned them into a digital folder labeled Property Verification. The small act of saving them felt like reclaiming something larger: my father's trust, my dignity, maybe even my voice. At noon, I called Lauren, an old friend from college who had gone into law. We hadn't talked in months, but I trusted her. She picked up on the second ring, cheerful as always. "Wow, it's been ages. What's up?" I hesitated. I think my sisters are trying to rent out my dad's property without permission. There was a pause, then the tone of her voice shifted, calm, precise, professional. "All right, start from the top. Tell me everything you have." I told her about the texts, the group chat, the realtor rumor, the wine glass, everything. She didn't interrupt, didn't dramatize. When I finished, she said, "Good. You're doing the right thing documenting this. Don't engage with them emotionally. Just gather everything. Every document, every message, every conversation, timestamp it all." "Should I confront them?" I asked. "Not yet," she said. "Emotion is their battlefield, facts are yours." Her words sank in like a lesson I should have learned years ago. Emotion was their battlefield. Facts were mine. I spent the rest of the day turning memory into evidence. I pulled up years of bank statements and printed every transfer labeled loan to Kara or help for Melissa. I found old emails from my dad thanking me for paying contractors on time. From the same account that had forwarded me his insurance receipts. Layer by layer, I built a wall of quiet truth. Around 4 o'clock, I drove to the storage unit where Dad's old safe boxes were kept. I hadn't opened them since his passing. Inside, under a folded fishing jacket, I found an envelope marked in his handwriting. House repairs 2016-2019. Inside were handwritten notes on costs, check copies, and a photo of me standing on the porch with a paint roller. His note on the back of the photo simply said, "She did this." That was the moment I stopped feeling angry. I felt seen. My father's recognition, those 3 words, were worth more than any inheritance, more than any argument that could follow. That night I spread everything across the dining table. The deed, the invoices, the will, the notes. Proof, hard, undeniable, dated proof. I took pictures of the entire layout, each page labeled by year, and uploaded them to cloud storage. Then, for the first time in weeks, I slept deeply. But the calm didn't last long, because proof, while powerful, doesn't stop people like my sisters, it just provokes them. And the next step would show exactly how far they were willing to go. A week after my call with Lauren, I finally decided it was time to bring someone else into the picture, someone who knew my father's affairs even better than I did. That's how I found myself walking up the familiar steps to Mr. Chen's office, a small corner space above the town's post office that still smelled faintly of dust and printer ink. He had been my father's accountant for almost 20 years, a quiet man who believed in 2 things: paper trails and consequences. He greeted me with a warm but cautious smile. "I was wondering when you'd come by," he said, motioning toward the same leather chair I used to sit in as a teenager when Dad brought me along for tax meetings. I sat down, clutching the folder of documents I'd assembled. "I need your help," I said, my voice lower than I expected. "It's about the lake house." He nodded slowly, already sensing the weight behind the words. "Your sisters." "Yes," I said. "They've been trying to claim it's still part of the family estate. They're spreading stories, and I think they've already tried to rent it out behind my back." Mr. Chen leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Do you have documentation?" That question, always the same one he'd asked my father, felt like both a test and an anchor. I slid the folder across the desk. He opened it carefully, scanning through the deed, tax receipts, and maintenance records. His eyebrows lifted slightly when he reached the will clause. "Your father was explicit," he murmured. "This isn't ambiguous. The property was transferred to you before he passed, fully paid off, fully notarized. Your name alone appears on the title." "I know," I said, "but they don't care about what's legal. They care about what feels fair to them, and they're good at twisting feelings." He looked up then, his gaze steady but kind. "Then don't fight them on feelings, fight them on paper." He turned to his computer, typing briskly. "I'll draft an updated ownership summary, title verification, payment history, maintenance ledger. I'll have it notarized and mailed to you by tomorrow." A sense of calm settled over me. For the first time, I felt the ground solid beneath my feet. Mr. Chen leaned back again. "But that's not enough," he said. "If they're trying to rent or sell it, we'll need to put a formal notice on file. Something that makes it clear any third party doing business with them would be liable for fraud." "Can we do that?" He smiled faintly. "We can. It's called a notice of interest. It'll freeze any transaction until proven valid. Consider it your legal shield." I sat back, absorbing his words. Legal shield. It sounded cold, but in that moment it felt like peace. Before I left, he pulled a manila envelope from a drawer. "Your father made me promise to give you this someday," he said. Inside was an old, yellowed letter in my father's handwriting. I unfolded it with trembling fingers. "If you're reading this, I trust you've already learned what I tried to teach you. Take care of what's yours, but more importantly, take care of yourself. Not everyone who shares your name will share your values. Love them anyway, but love yourself enough to draw the line." I swallowed hard, blinking away the tears that rose before I could stop them. That letter wasn't just comfort, it was permission. Mr. Chen cleared his throat. "You have every right to protect what he left you, and you're doing it the right way, quietly, with documentation. Don't let their noise make you forget that." I thanked him, tucking the letter and documents back into my bag. As I walked out into the crisp afternoon air, the town felt different somehow, smaller, clearer. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was building something. That night, I sat at my desk and started a timeline. Each event, each message, each receipt organized, dated, factual. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. I drafted an outline for a meeting my sisters had suggested, a family discussion, as they'd called it. Mr. Chen agreed to attend as my witness. My plan wasn't to confront them yet. It was to let them expose themselves, calmly and publicly. And when they did, I'd have everything, every word, every lie, every piece of evidence, ready to meet them with truth. I ended the night with one final task, writing an email to my lawyer, copying Mr. Chen, summarizing the situation and attaching scans of every document. At the bottom, I added one simple line: I'm ready to move forward. It was the first time in months I'd ended a day without feeling like I was waiting for someone else to do the right thing. The afternoon of the meeting, I arrived early at the lake house. The air smelled of cedar and lake mist, the way it always did after rain. I unlocked the door, tidied the already spotless living room, and brewed a pot of coffee, not for comfort, but because I needed something to do with my hands. Mr. Chen was already on his way, his calm voice still echoing in my mind. You're not going there to argue. You're going there to confirm. At exactly 2:07 p.m., Lauren's silver SUV pulled up, followed by Danielle's smaller sedan. They came dressed like they were attending a business meeting, matching blazers, manicured smiles, sunglasses perched perfectly in place. My stomach tightened, but I stood tall. I reminded myself of the papers in my bag, the title deed, the ownership ledger, and the letter from my father. This wasn't about emotions anymore. It was about facts. Lauren walked in first, her perfume flooding the room. Wow, still cozy, she said, glancing around. We were just saying on the drive over this place could easily go for 1,000 a night, maybe more in summer. Danielle set her purse down and gave me a quick, sugary smile. So, we should probably talk business. We already drafted some listings, just placeholders, to save time once you agree. I exhaled slowly. Agree to what exactly? Danielle looked at Lauren, who gave an exaggerated laugh. Come on, don't make this difficult. We'll handle everything, maintenance, bookings, guests. You'll still get a share, of course. But since you don't really use it much, it only makes sense we manage it for profit. Before I could respond, Mr. Chen entered. The sound of the door clicking shut behind him shifted the room's balance instantly. Lauren's smile faltered for the first time. Oh, she said, you brought backup. Advisor, Mr. Chen corrected politely. Good afternoon, ladies. He set his briefcase on the coffee table and opened it with the quiet precision of a surgeon. Inside were the printed documents, each one neatly labeled and dated. He placed them one by one on the table: deed, tax records, ownership certificate. The silence stretched, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. Lauren crossed her arms. What is this supposed to be? Mr. Chen gestured calmly to the papers. Evidence of ownership. The property belongs solely to your sister. Any attempt to rent, sell, or list it under another name would constitute fraud. Danielle's face flushed, but she forced a laugh. You're making this sound so legal. We're family, for God's sake. I met her eyes. That's exactly why we need clarity, because I'm done letting family mean whatever suits you that week. Lauren's voice sharpened. So you're really choosing some accountant over your own sisters? No, I said quietly. I'm choosing boundaries, and I'm choosing peace. The tension in the room thickened. I could see the moment Lauren realized she couldn't intimidate her way through this. Her expression shifted from faux concern to cold calculation. You think a few papers change anything? You wouldn't even have this place without us watching Dad while you lived your little city life. It stung more than I wanted to admit, but I didn't flinch. I slid one more document across the table, a printed email chain between my father and the estate lawyer, dated 2 months before his passing. In it, he'd explicitly written, "The lake house is for her peace, not their profit." Lauren stared at the line, her jaw tightening. Danielle's eyes flickered between us, her voice smaller now. You kept that. I kept everything, I said, because I knew this day would come. For a moment, the only sound was the lake water tapping gently against the dock outside. Then Lauren leaned back, exhaling sharply. Fine, but don't come crying when you realize you've isolated yourself. You'll need us eventually. Maybe, I said, standing, but not today. Mr. Chen began gathering the papers, each one sliding neatly back into his case. "I'll be filing the notice of interest with the county registrar this week," he said. "Just a formality, but it ensures legal protection." Danielle looked uneasy now, her earlier confidence deflated. "We just wanted to help," she said softly. I nodded. "Then you can start by respecting what's mine." They left a few minutes later, slamming the door harder than necessary. Through the window, I watched Lauren muttering angrily as she stormed to her car. Mr. Chen remained quiet, letting the silence settle before speaking. "They're not used to hearing no," he said. "No," I agreed, staring at the driveway where their cars disappeared. "But they'll learn to." He smiled faintly. "That's what documentation is for. It teaches truth in a language emotion can't distort." After he left, I stood alone in the stillness of the lake house. For the first time in years, it felt like mine again, not because of the paper in a drawer, but because of the peace filling its rooms. Still, something inside me knew this wasn't over. Lauren's pride wouldn't let her lose quietly, and when people like her feel cornered, they don't surrender, they scheme. The calm that followed our confrontation lasted only a few days. I should have known better. Silence was never surrender for my sisters. It was strategy. By the end of the week, my phone began lighting up with messages from old family friends, distant cousins, even a few neighbors from the lake community. The tone was always the same. "I didn't realize things had gotten so bad between you all," or "I'm sorry to hear you're keeping the property from your family." I sat there staring at the messages, my stomach tightening with that old, familiar mix of disbelief and exhaustion. They started a campaign, a smear, dressed in politeness, but designed to cut deep. Lauren's post on social media was carefully worded, a masterclass in manipulation. "It's sad when some people forget what family means and turn love into ownership. Some of us still remember who Dad wanted this house to serve." Hundreds of likes, dozens of comments full of sympathy and thinly veiled judgment. And the worst part? They'd tagged the location, my lake house. I didn't even need to read further to know what came next. Someone had probably started inquiring about rentals, thinking I'd listed it. By the second day, Danielle joined in, responding to comments like, "We just want to share it, not profit. Some people just don't value legacy." Her phrasing was surgical, no direct lies, but enough insinuation to twist the narrative completely. They were painting me as greedy and cold-hearted, as if I'd betrayed some sacred family trust. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. But then I remembered what Mr. Chen said. Noise dies when met with documentation. So I opened my laptop and started collecting screenshots, timestamps, post URLs, comment threads, even their deleted replies. I cataloged every digital whisper of their manipulation, labeling the files carefully. Each piece became another entry in the growing evidence folder I now referred to, half-jokingly, as the Truth Archive. That evening, I called Mr. Chen and my lawyer, Amelia. Her tone was crisp, the kind that could cut through chaos like glass. "This is defamation by implication," she said after reading through the screenshots. "They're not nomming you outright, but they're clearly referring to you, and the tagging of your property's location could even be considered harassment." "What can we do about it?" I asked. "First, we draft a cease and desist, but we'll do it quietly," she said. "You'll send it privately. No posts, no public reaction. Let them expose themselves further while we secure the legal footing." The next morning, she sent me the draft. It was firm but calm, written in the same tone I wished I could maintain in every emotional storm. It stated clearly that the posts were defamatory, that the lake house was privately owned and not part of the shared estate, and that any continued public commentary would be treated as libel. It ended with one line that made me exhale deeply. "This notice serves as a formal warning to cease all public misrepresentation of ownership or intent." I forwarded it to both Lauren and Danielle. No message, no emotion, just the letter. Lauren's reply came within an hour. "Wow, a cease and desist, against your own sisters, you've really lost it." Danielle followed with a shorter message. "This is embarrassing for all of us. People are already talking. You're making it worse." I didn't respond. Instead, I printed their replies, added them to the archive, and went on with my day. 2 days later, the smear shifted again. This time, they didn't post directly, they let others do it for them. One of Lauren's friends made a public post about greedy relatives who forget what love looks like, and Danielle liked it. Subtle but traceable. Amelia noticed before I did. "Good," she said when I called her. "They're proving your case for you. Keep collecting." Still, despite the calm logic of our strategy, I couldn't pretend it didn't hurt. Seeing my name, my character, dragged into whispers and gossip felt like a bruise that wouldn't fade. My chest tightened every time I opened my phone, and I wondered how many people believed them. That weekend, I drove to the lake house again, hoping the still water would remind me why I was fighting. But when I pulled into the driveway, I froze. There was a rental sign staked into the ground near the gate, weatherproof, printed, professional. "Lakefront Escape, now booking summer 2025. My hands shook as I pulled it out of the ground. The phone number listed wasn't mine. It was Danielle's. I took a photo of the sign, called Amelia immediately, and emailed it to her with the subject line, "They've crossed the line." Her response came quickly. "We move forward Monday morning. Fraud, defamation, and trespass. Stay calm, you have the receipts, they don't." That night, as the lake reflected the silver of the moonlight, I sat on the porch and read my father's letter again. Not everyone who shares your name will share your values. He'd known, somehow, that this moment would come. I realized then that justice wasn't loud, it was patient. It gathered quietly, like a tide, until it was ready to pull the lies out by their roots. And mine was almost ready. The letter from Amelia arrived on Monday morning, printed on firm ivory paper that seemed to hum with quiet authority. She sent copies to both my sisters and the county property board, just as she promised. What I didn't expect, however, was the follow-up email that came later that afternoon, an official notice of a community review. Someone, very likely Lauren, had filed a complaint with the town claiming that ownership of the lake house was in dispute. It was the last card they could play, forcing the matter into a public setting, hoping to shame me or twist perception one last time. The hearing was scheduled for Friday evening at the old town hall. I hadn't been there in years, not since my father spoke at a local council meeting about preserving the lakefront from commercial overdevelopment. The memory came flooding back, the same wooden benches, the smell of varnish, the low murmur of community gossip rising like static before a storm. When Friday arrived, I dressed carefully but simply. A navy blouse, my father's old wristwatch, no jewelry that could be mistaken for vanity. This wasn't about presentation, it was about presence. I carried a leather folder tucked under my arm containing everything: the notarized deed, the property tax ledgers, the will excerpts, the cease and desist letter, and the printed screenshots of their social media posts. Mr. Chen met me outside the hall. "Stay measured," he said quietly. "Let the documents speak." Inside, the seats were filled with familiar faces, neighbors, business owners, even a few people from church. Lauren and Danielle sat near the front, whispering to each other. Faces composed but eyes sharp. Lauren wore a crisp white suit that screamed control, while Danielle clutched a tissue like a stage prop. They had always known how to perform sympathy. When the session began, the board chair, an older woman named Mrs. Jennings, adjusted her glasses and read aloud the complaint. Allegation of disputed inheritance and unauthorized occupancy of shared family property. Lauren stood immediately. "With respect," she began, her tone syrupy, "we're not here to start a fight. We just want fairness. Our father built that lake house for all of us, but lately one of us," she glanced at me, "has decided to lock us out and even threaten us with lawyers. We just want to preserve the family legacy." A sympathetic murmur rippled through the room. She knew exactly how to work them, how to make greed sound like nostalgia. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, unfolding the papers on the table before me. My voice came out steady, even softer than I expected. "With respect, my father didn't leave the house to all of us. He gave it to me. He said it was for peace, not profit. I have his signed and notarized will, and I have the deed transferred before his passing." Lauren laughed lightly, the kind of laugh meant to undermine. "That's convenient. Do you have proof of that transfer?" I opened my folder and placed the deed on the table, sliding it forward. Yes, I said simply. The room fell into a hush as Mrs. Jennings read the document. She looked up, brow furrowed. This is legally valid, dated and recorded 2 years prior to your father's passing. Danielle's lips trembled. He didn't mean for it to be forever, she said softly, playing the sentimental card. He just wanted her to look after it. I did look after it, I replied. I paid every tax, every repair, every bill, and when you tried to rent it out behind my back, I handled that too. A few gasps fluttered through the room. Lauren's jaw clenched. That's not true. I pulled another document from the folder, a printed photo of the rental sign, dated and geotagged. This was found on my property. The number listed belongs to Danielle. The murmur this time wasn't sympathetic. It was sharp and disbelieving. Someone whispered, "That's fraud." Lauren's voice rose, the veneer cracking. "You're twisting everything. You think a stack of papers makes you better than us." Mrs. Jennings struck the gavel once. "Please, Ms. Walters, let her finish." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I'm not better," I said. "I'm just done being bullied for doing the right thing. I respected my father's wishes, even when they weren't convenient. All I've asked is that you do the same." Then I placed the final document on the table, a printed copy of the email chain from my father, signed and time-stamped. "The lake house is for her peace, not their profit." The words hung in the air, heavier than any argument could. Danielle's tears this time were real. Lauren's face hardened into something brittle, cornered. Mrs. Jennings leaned forward, scanning the page again before speaking. "This matter is closed. Ownership is not in dispute, and I advise all parties to refrain from further public commentary. The records will reflect the finding." The gavel struck again, final and clean. As the meeting adjourned, a few neighbors came up quietly, offering nods of support. Lauren stormed past without a word, her heels clacking like gunfire against the wooden floor. Danielle lingered for a moment, eyes red, then whispered, "You didn't have to do this in front of everyone." "Yes," I said gently, "I did, because you made it public first." Outside, the air smelled of rain and pine. Mr. Chen stood beside me, watching the sisters' cars disappear down the winding road. "It's done," he said simply. "Not entirely," I replied, feeling the ache behind my ribs. "Winning doesn't always feel good." But it did feel right. The morning after the hearing, the lake was still. The surface lay unbroken except for the slow drift of fallen leaves, and for a long while I stood on the porch just watching them. It should have felt like peace. It should have felt like victory. But what I felt instead was something quieter, heavier, like the ache that comes after holding your breath for too long. My phone had been silent all night, no messages from Lauren or Danielle. That silence, oddly enough, was louder than their accusations had ever been. It meant retreat. It meant distance. And as much as I'd told myself that's what I wanted, there was a part of me that grieved it, grieved the idea of family, even the broken one. By noon, I received a brief call from Mrs. Jennings, confirming the board's formal record. "It's official," she said kindly. "You're in the clear, the dispute is closed." Her voice softened. "You handled yourself with grace. Not many people could have stayed that calm." I thanked her, though I barely heard the words. Grace. Calm. Those were the things I had clung to so tightly that I hadn't realized how much they'd cost me. When I checked social media later, I found that Lauren had deleted her earlier posts. No apology, no correction, just gone. Danielle had switched her account to private. The silence spread there too, but I could still feel the echo of what they'd done. The comments, the whispers, they lingered like smoke in a room that's already been aired out. That evening, I went into town for groceries. As I walked through the aisles, people greeted me politely, but I could see the small, curious glances, half sympathy, half gossip. A few even approached me to say they were sorry for the family trouble. I nodded, smiled, moved on. There was no point trying to explain. The truth had already been spoken once. Explaining it again would only cheapen it. When I got back to the house, I saw an envelope propped against the door. No return address, but I knew the handwriting immediately, Danielle's. I stood there for a minute before opening it. Inside was a short letter written in shaky pen strokes. "I didn't know it would go this far," it said. "I never wanted it to get ugly. Lauren told me we were just protecting what was ours. I didn't realize we were hurting you. I'm sorry." No signature, no apology from Lauren. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my father's box, the one that held his notes, his will, and the letter he'd written to me. It didn't erase what happened, but it meant something, a crack in the wall, a flicker of truth. Maybe someday that would be enough. Later that night, Mr. Chen called. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Tired," I admitted, "but relieved." "That's normal," he said. "Justice isn't just about winning, it's about making peace with the cost." He was right. The cost was clear. 2 sisters who now saw me as an outsider, a family thread pulled loose from its pattern. But I also gained something back, dignity, my father's trust, my own boundaries. Over the next few days, I started cleaning the lake house. It wasn't a dramatic purge, just quiet, intentional work. I packed up some of Dad's old fishing gear, replaced broken window latches, sanded the porch railings. With each small act, the place began to feel like mine again, not an inheritance under dispute, but a home under healing. One afternoon, as I was painting the porch steps, a neighbor stopped by, Mrs. Dale, who'd known our family since I was a child. She brought a basket of fresh bread and jam, smiling gently. "I just wanted to say," she said, "your father would have been proud, not because you fought, but because you didn't let the fight change who you are." It was the first time since the ordeal began that I let myself cry. Not angry tears this time, just release. That night I sat by the fireplace with a mug of tea, scrolling through old photos on my phone. One of them caught me off guard, a picture from years ago, me, Lauren, and Danielle at the lake, laughing, all sunburned and happy. Before the arguments, before the entitlement. For a moment, I let myself remember them that way. Then I tucked the memory away, like a page in a book I no longer needed to reread. Justice had been done, but peace, that would take time, and maybe that was okay. A few weeks passed, and the rhythm of my days began to change. The lake house no longer felt like a battleground. It breathed again, alive with quiet. The mornings were slow and golden, the kind where sunlight filtered through the pines and danced on the kitchen counters. I'd wake early, make coffee, and sit on the porch with my notebook, writing small fragments of thoughts, less about the past, more about what could come next. Healing, I realized, wasn't just about closing wounds. It was about planting something where the hurt used to live. One morning, as I flipped through my father's old ledger, an unassuming brown book filled with his neat handwriting, I found a note tucked between the pages. It wasn't official or notarized, just a simple line written in blue ink. "Legacy is what you build quietly when no one's clapping." He had probably written it for himself, but it landed in me like a seed. That afternoon, I drove into town and met with Mrs. Jennings at the community center. She was helping coordinate the summer programs, and when I told her my idea, her face softened. "A scholarship?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "for students here who want to study environmental science or community planning, something that connects them back to the lake, to preserving it." She smiled. "That's beautiful, your father would have loved that." I shrugged, but I felt my throat tighten. He loved this place. It's time I stop just defending what he left me and start doing something with it. Within a week, we had the framework, the Walters Lake Foundation. Small, simple, local. I pledged an annual fund using the rent money I'd refused to let my sisters take. Irony had its poetry. The first scholarships would go to 2 high school seniors that summer. I reached out to Mr. Chen for help setting up the financial side. He came by the house one morning, bringing pastries and his trademark calm. "I knew your father would have wanted this," he said, reviewing the documents. "He always said you had his sense of purpose." I laughed softly. "Is that what this is? Purpose?" He smiled. "It's the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need an audience." Later that day, I drove into the nearby town to open the foundation's account at the local bank. The clerk, a young woman named Elise, recognized my name and said shyly, "I saw what happened at the hearing. I just wanted to say, I think you handled it with real grace." That word again. Grace. It followed me everywhere now, as if life was reminding me to hold it close, even when pride wanted to speak louder. As the paperwork went through, I realized something unexpected. This wasn't just about righting what had been wronged. It was about redefining my story. For months, maybe years, I'd been reacting to my sisters, to their demands, to the noise. Now I was creating. When I returned home, I stood at the edge of the dock, the late afternoon sun washing the lake in gold. The breeze carried the scent of pine and water lilies, the same scent from every childhood summer. For the first time since my father's death, I spoke aloud to the air, half expecting him to answer. "I think I get it now, Dad," I said softly. "You weren't just giving me a house, you were giving me a place to stand." That night I printed the scholarship announcement, a simple page with his favorite quote at the bottom: "Peace is built, not granted." I pinned it to the community board outside the general store. As I did, I noticed a familiar car pull up. Danielle stepped out, hesitant, clutching her phone. We locked eyes. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she approached slowly. "I heard about the foundation," she said. "It's good what you're doing." "Thank you," I said carefully. "I meant what I wrote," she added, "about being sorry." "I know," I replied, and I did. She hesitated, then nodded once before walking back to her car. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning, and that, I decided, was enough. As I walked back toward my car, the flyer fluttered gently in the breeze, catching the sunlight. I realized that the story wasn't ending with division or revenge. It was ending with roots, something planted deep enough to last longer than resentment. The months that followed felt like the calm after a long, punishing storm. The kind of calm that isn't empty, but earned, quiet, steady, deliberate. I had started to notice the smallest things again. The way the sunlight stretched longer in the afternoons. The laughter of the kids who came to the lake for summer camp. The sound of my own breath when I wasn't rushing to defend something or explain myself. I spent more time at the community center, helping with scholarship applications and mentoring 2 students who'd been chosen for the first Walters Lake Foundation grants. One of them, a shy 17-year-old named Maya, told me she wanted to study ecology so she could learn how to protect the places people forget to care for. Her words hit me deep. That was exactly what I had been doing without realizing it, protecting something everyone else treated like property or profit. Sometimes, late at night, I'd still think about my sisters, about how easily family ties can twist when money and entitlement get involved. The old me would have replayed every argument, every insult. But now, I found myself thinking less about what they took and more about what I still had. My father's principles, my peace, and my own sense of integrity. I started keeping a small notebook I called Boundaries and Lessons. Not a diary, not revenge fuel, just notes to remind myself what I'd learned the hard way. Lesson 1, silence isn't weakness, it's strategy when used wisely. Lesson 2, if they only respect you when you're useful, that isn't respect. Lesson 3, always keep your receipts, financial, emotional, spiritual. Lesson 4, justice doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. I wanted to share those lessons, not as advice from a victim, but as tools for anyone walking the same line between peace and self-protection. So I began drafting an article for a local newsletter called Quiet Justice, setting boundaries without breaking down. I wrote about my father's teachings, about the power of documentation, and about the importance of knowing when to walk away rather than fight endlessly. Before submitting it, I included a short disclaimer. Names and details have been changed to protect privacy. This story is inspired by true events. It wasn't about outing anyone, it was about freeing myself, turning private pain into something that might guide someone else. The article published 2 weeks later. To my surprise, the response was overwhelming. Messages came in from people who'd been through similar family disputes, women who'd lost inheritance battles, and even a few men who said they'd learned to handle family greed with calm instead of rage. "You showed that dignity can be a weapon," one message read. That line stayed with me. I'd once thought victory meant proving my sisters wrong in court, but now I saw it differently. Victory was sleeping through the night without bitterness. It was walking into my home without the tension of old ghosts. It was hearing someone else say, "You helped me see I'm not crazy for protecting what's mine." One evening, as I was leaving the community center, I saw an older man standing by the donation box. He nodded toward the foundation flyer and said, "Your father would be proud." I smiled, holding back the tears that came more easily these days, not from sadness, but from peace. When I got home, I poured tea, sat on the porch, and flipped through my notebook. The last page was blank, and I wrote, "Closure isn't about forgiveness. It's about balance. When you stand firm with grace, life eventually aligns itself around that truth." That night, I turned off my phone, closed the ledger, and finally exhaled fully. The fight was over, not because someone declared it, but because I had decided it was. The lake was glassy that morning, still enough to reflect the entire sky. It was one of those rare days when silence felt like company rather than emptiness. I sat on the edge of the dock with a mug of coffee, the same dock where I'd once stood trembling after the court hearing, unsure what kind of life waited for me beyond the chaos. Now I wasn't trembling. I was steady. The air was cool, but the sunlight was soft, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to brace myself for another blow. I took a deep breath, letting the smell of pine and water settle into me. It's funny, when you stop fighting for survival, you start hearing the world again. The hum of the insects, the gentle slap of water against wood, the way your own heartbeat slows down when peace finally becomes your default instead of your reward. That's when I opened my laptop and began typing a letter, not to my sisters, not even to my father, but to anyone who would ever find themselves in my position. "You are not selfish for saying no," I wrote. "You are not cruel for protecting what's yours. You do not owe anyone the version of you that tolerates their entitlement." It wasn't a rant. It was a message from someone who'd made it through the fire and could finally look back without burning again. I spoke directly to the camera, recording what would become my final message for this chapter of my life. My tone wasn't angry or defensive. It was calm, measured, the way you sound when you've stopped needing to be understood and started focusing on being at peace. I told the viewers about the lessons my father had left me, the quiet dignity of proof, the value of patience, the strength in walking away with your integrity intact. I spoke about how hard it was to hold your ground when everyone around you calls you heartless. I reminded them that peace doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like solitude, like silence, like a boundary held without apology. And I ended with this. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that justice isn't about punishment, it's about restoration. It's about giving yourself back the power they tried to take. It's about creating something beautiful from the wreckage. And if you can do that, you've already won. After I finished recording, I uploaded the video, letting it join the small but growing collection of stories about real people who chose grace over chaos. Within hours, the comments began to flood in, people from all over the country, some even from other countries, sharing their own stories. A woman wrote, "You made me realize I don't need to keep proving my worth to my family." Another said, "Your peace feels contagious." Reading those messages, I realized this was the real ending, not the courtroom victory, not the scholarship launch, but this connection. A ripple effect of quiet empowerment spreading outward. Later that evening, I returned to the dock one last time before closing the chapter. The sun was sinking behind the trees, turning the lake a soft gold. I whispered a quiet thank you to my father, to myself, even to the storm that had forced me to rebuild. Because without it, I might never have discovered how much strength can exist in silence. I stood, took one final look at the house, and smiled. The lake, the home, the peace, it was all intact. Not because I fought for it with anger, but because I protected it with truth. And that was the greatest inheritance of all. After the video went live, I didn't expect much. Maybe a few polite comments, a handful of viewers who would nod quietly and move on. But over the next few days, my inbox filled with messages that stopped me cold. There were emails from teachers, single parents, even a retired nurse who said she'd watched my video 3 times and cried each time. She wrote, "You said what I never could. Thank you for showing me that silence can still be power." That line echoed in my head for days. Silence can still be power. It reminded me of all the moments when I'd been accused of being cold, detached, too composed. My sisters had mistaken my stillness for surrender, when in truth, it had been my weapon. It wasn't about staying quiet forever. It was about choosing when to speak and making every word count when I finally did. The following week, I was invited to speak at a local women's circle, a small, cozy gathering at the town library. I almost said no. Public speaking had never been my comfort zone. But something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the realization that my story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been told to keep the peace at their own expense. That evening, I stood in front of a small group of women, their faces kind but tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying too many unspoken stories. I didn't bring notes. I didn't read from a script. I just told the truth. I told them about the house, about my sisters, about how easily greed hides behind the mask of family loyalty. And then I said something that came straight from my gut. We've been taught that being good means being quiet, but sometimes being good means saying no and meaning it. The room was silent for a moment, then someone started clapping softly. Then another. Before I knew it, the sound filled the space, not like applause for performance, but as recognition, like they were clapping for themselves, too. After the event, a young woman came up to me with tears in her eyes. "I've been afraid to stand up to my brother about our inheritance," she confessed. "But I think I'm ready now." I hugged her, and in that moment, I realized the story had come full circle. What had started as a private war over a house had turned into a quiet movement, one that lived in the spaces between people who were done apologizing for wanting fairness. The next morning, I received a letter, an actual paper letter, from someone who'd seen my video online. It was signed simply, "A daughter who understands." Inside was a short note. "You showed us that justice can be calm and boundaries can be love." I kept it on my desk beside my father's old ledger, where his handwriting still read, "Legacy is what you build quietly when no one's clapping." For the first time, I felt like I truly understood what that meant. Legacy wasn't about money or even reputation. It was about how you made people feel safer in their own truth. It was about turning your scars into roadmaps for someone else. That night, as I looked out over the lake, I realized something simple but powerful. The world doesn't need more noise. It needs more proof that peace can win. And if my story could be even one small piece of that proof, then everything I had endured, the betrayal, the loneliness, the fight, had found its meaning. Autumn came early that year. The air around the lake grew cooler, sharper, carrying that faint scent of wood smoke and damp pine that always meant change was near. The trees turned from green to gold to rust, and the reflection on the water looked like the world itself was on fire, but in a soft, forgiving way. I spent my mornings on the same porch my father had built decades ago, a blanket over my legs, watching the mist drift off the surface of the lake. Every day it lifted a little slower, as if time was reminding me to slow down too. The foundation had taken off better than I'd ever expected. Local news had done a small feature about the first 2 scholarship recipients, and suddenly the community started donating, small amounts, but heartfelt ones. Retired fishermen, local teachers, even the bakery owner who used to tease my father for being too serious about that lake. The people here understood what it meant to protect something sacred, something that couldn't be measured by money or divided by legal papers. One afternoon, as I was sorting through envelopes at my kitchen table, I found one with unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a card that read simply, "I hope we can start over someday. Danielle." I sat there for a long time, staring at her name. My first reaction was disbelief, then caution, and finally something softer, understanding. We hadn't spoken since that day outside the general store. Part of me had accepted that we might never speak again. But this small olive branch, tentative, unsteady, felt like a shift. I didn't rush to respond. I didn't owe her forgiveness, not yet. But I did owe myself peace, and sometimes that means allowing space for possibility. So I placed the card beside my father's ledger, not as a token of reconciliation, but as a reminder that healing doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it begins when you stop needing closure from the people who hurt you. That night, I walked down to the dock again. The water was dark, almost mirror black, and I caught my reflection in it, older, steadier, a little wiser. I thought about how much I had changed since that first day my sisters demanded I hand over the vacation home. Back then, I'd felt small, cornered, unsure if standing up for myself was worth the fallout. Now, I understood that boundaries weren't walls. They were doors you lock when peace lives inside. As I stood there, a breeze rustled through the trees, and I heard my father's voice in my memory, soft, amused. "Never let anyone rent out your peace for profit." I smiled through the lump in my throat. He'd always had a way of saying things that sounded like jokes until years later when you realized they were lessons. The moon came out then, pale and full, painting the water in silver light. I took a deep breath and whispered, "Thank you, Dad, for everything." I turned and walked back toward the house, the porch light glowing warm against the darkness. I didn't look back this time. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't holding onto the past. I was walking forward, carrying only what was worth keeping. The first snow came earlier than anyone expected that year. I woke up to find the world outside blanketed in white, soft, unbroken, and impossibly quiet. It was as if the lake itself had exhaled, covering every scar, every footprint, every memory beneath a layer of clean stillness. I stood at the window with my coffee, watching flakes drift lazily past the glass, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, contentment without condition. The house, once filled with tension and echoes of old arguments, had become a home again. I'd learned to enjoy its silences, its creaks, even the draft that sneaked through the old window frames. Every sound felt honest. Every corner held peace instead of history. Sometimes I still expected to hear my sisters' laughter down the hallway, the way it had been when we were kids, before money and entitlement built walls between us. But now, when those memories came, they didn't hurt. They simply existed, like ghosts I no longer feared. That morning, I opened the small box where I'd kept my father's ledger, Danielle's card, and the newspaper clipping about the foundation. They weren't trophies. They were milestones. Each piece told a different part of the story, proof not of victory, but of growth. The foundation was thriving. The scholarship recipients had sent thank you letters, describing how the grants had changed their lives. One of them, Maya, had written, "You taught me that protecting the earth starts with protecting your peace." It made me smile. Maybe that's what legacy really was, less about what we leave behind, more about what we set in motion. Around noon, I bundled up and took a walk through the woods. The air was sharp and crisp, the kind that wakes you up from the inside. I followed the path to the small clearing where my father used to set up a campfire. The benches were still there, half buried in snow, and I brushed one off before sitting down. For a long time, I just listened, to the silence, to the whisper of the wind through the trees. I realized then that my journey had never truly been about the house. It had been about ownership, yes, but not of land or property, ownership of self. For years, I'd been so focused on protecting what my father built that I'd forgotten to nurture what I was building within myself. Standing my ground had forced me to find my footing, not just legally, but emotionally. As I sat there, I pulled out my phone and recorded a short note to myself, just a voice memo. "You made it," I whispered. "You protected your father's legacy, but more importantly, you created your own. You didn't lose yourself to bitterness. You turned boundaries into roots." The wind carried my voice across the snow, and I imagined it traveling far beyond the trees, blending with the world's hum. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, it was simply honest. By the time I got back to the house, the light was fading. I lit a fire, wrapped myself in a blanket, and sat by the window, watching the snow fall thicker now, covering everything in clean white silence. For the first time in my life, peace didn't feel like something I had to fight for. It was just there, steady and whole, waiting for me to accept it. And I did, fully. A few days after the snow had settled, the town invited me to a small ceremony at the community hall. They wanted to honor the Walters Lake Foundation for its early impact, just a local gesture, a quiet recognition. At first, I hesitated. Public acknowledgement had never been my goal, but as I looked at the folded invitations sitting on the kitchen counter, I thought about my father and how proud he would have been to see the town celebrate something born from our shared values. So I went. The hall was warm and full of familiar faces, Teachers, parents, students, and old neighbors who remembered my father's jokes about the lake being a jealous old friend that never wanted to be ignored. There was laughter, clinking cups, the hum of small-town chatter. For the first time, walking into a crowded room didn't fill me with dread or defensiveness. I wasn't the woman who had to explain herself anymore. I was just someone who had lived through something hard and decided to make something good out of it. When they called my name to come up and speak, I felt the familiar flutter in my chest, but not fear, just humility. I walked to the front, looking at the crowd, their expectant faces soft and kind. I didn't prepare a speech. I simply spoke from my heart. I used to think justice was about proving someone wrong, I began. But the truth is, justice is quieter than that. It's about balance. It's about taking what hurt you and turning it into something that helps someone else. When you choose dignity over chaos, you're not just saving yourself, you're giving other people permission to do the same. I saw a few heads nod, a few eyes glisten. I told them about my father's words, the lessons hidden in his ledger, and how what started as a legal battle turned into a moral one. My sisters thought I was fighting for a house, I said softly, but what I was really protecting was peace. And peace doesn't have a price tag, it has principles. The room went quiet for a moment, and then the applause came, not loud or rowdy, but genuine, like the steady rhythm of shared understanding. After the ceremony, people came up to thank me, not for winning anything, but for standing for something. One woman said, "You gave me hope that I can set boundaries with grace." Another handed me a small envelope with a donation for the foundation. It wasn't much, but it was heartfelt. Every gesture that night reminded me how powerfully our quiet choices can ripple through others' lives. When the event ended, I stepped outside into the cold night air. Snowflakes sparkled under the streetlights, and the town looked peaceful, wrapped in winter's hush. I stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of the moment, not the heaviness of burden, but the fullness of meaning. I realized I wasn't standing in the shadow of the past anymore. I was walking in the light of what came after. Later, as I drove back to the lake house, I rolled down the window just a little. The wind stung my cheeks, but it felt good, alive. I thought about how far I'd come from that first confrontation, from all the nights I'd felt small and misunderstood. Now, my story wasn't about being right, it was about being whole. When I got home, I lit a single candle on the kitchen counter, poured a glass of wine, and whispered a quiet toast to the room. To peace earned, not given. And for the first time, I truly felt like I had arrived, not at the end of the story, but at the life I was always meant to live. The morning after the ceremony, I woke up before sunrise. The house was still, the air crisp with the faint scent of pine and lake water. For the first time in what felt like years, I didn't wake up bracing for another confrontation, another demand, another email filled with veiled threats. There was just peace and the quiet hum of possibility. I walked out to the porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, and watched the dawn spill gold across the frozen water. It looked like the lake itself was exhaling, its slow thaw mirroring my own. For months, I had been fighting, strategizing, proving, documenting. Now there was no one left to prove anything to. The documents were signed, the verdicts sealed, the noise had faded. What remained was the life I still had to live, and the question of what I wanted to do with it. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, flipping through an old leather journal my father used to write in. The pages were filled with tidy handwriting and little sketches of the property, measurements, notes about renovations, even the birds he'd seen near the dock. But in between all the practicalities, I found something unexpected. A letter. It wasn't addressed to me, but to whoever carries this home forward. He wrote about stewardship, about the difference between ownership and care. "A house can be held by law," he wrote, "but a home must be held by heart. Never let greed, pride, or fear make you forget which one you're protecting." I read that line 3 times, feeling the truth of it settle in my chest. My fight with my sisters had been about much more than real estate. It had been about the principle of care. They saw profit, I saw preservation. And in the end, my father's words proved what I had known all along. I wasn't guarding property, I was honoring a legacy. I decided then to start something new, a mentorship circle for young adults in town, especially those studying finance, law, or social work. I'd use the foundation to teach them the value of ethics, boundaries, and emotional intelligence in decision-making. Because if my own journey had taught me anything, it was that intelligence without integrity is just manipulation in a prettier suit. Later that week, I met with a few local educators and lawyers to discuss the idea. We sat around a wooden table at the town library, the air thick with the smell of old books and coffee. I told them I didn't want it to be another charity project. I wanted it to be an empowerment hub, a place where young people could learn not just how to win, but how to win right. They loved it. One of them, a retired attorney, smiled and said, "You're turning your receipts into resources." We laughed, but I felt tears sting my eyes. It was true. Every document I, once gathered as a weapon of defense, had now become a blueprint for teaching strength with compassion. When I drove home that evening, the setting sun painted the lake in copper and rose. I pulled over by the dock and sat for a moment, listening to the water's gentle lapping against the wood. I thought about my sisters, not with anger anymore, but with a quiet kind of acceptance. They were still chasing the next opportunity, still trying to outdo each other. Maybe one day they'd understand what I'd come to learn, that real wealth isn't measured in square footage or bank accounts. It's measured in how lightly you can live after setting down your burdens. As I got back into the car, I felt a sense of finality, not the sharp kind that comes from endings, but the soft, warm kind that comes from healing. My story had begun with entitlement and confrontation, but now it rested on purpose and peace. And that, I realized, was the truest form of justice I could have hoped for. The mentorship circle started small, just 6 young people sitting in the sunlit corner of the community library. They were nervous at first, unsure what to expect from me. I wasn't a professor, a lawyer, or a counselor. I was just someone who'd lived through a long, public reckoning and somehow found her way out with her dignity intact. But as the days turned into weeks, those small meetings began to grow into something much bigger. Every Thursday evening, the same room would fill with voices, students, young professionals, and even a few single parents, each with a story that echoed some part of mine. There was James, a law student who said he'd joined because he wanted to learn how to win without becoming the villain. There was Alina, who'd inherited her grandmother's shop but felt guilty for wanting to modernize it. And then there was Micah, a quiet high schooler who said he just wanted to learn how to say no without feeling mean. We began every session the same way, with a simple question written on the whiteboard. "What does fairness mean to you this week?" The answers were always different. Some said it was being heard. Others said it was setting limits. But one night, when the room was particularly still, Micah raised his hand and said, "Fairness is when you finally stop explaining why your peace matters." The room went silent, and I felt the hairs on my arms rise. That was it, the essence of everything I'd lived, everything I'd fought to understand. That evening, as everyone packed up their notebooks and thermoses, I caught sight of my father's handwriting again, copied from his old journal and pinned on the bulletin board. "A home must be held by heart." It reminded me that what I was building now wasn't just an organization, it was an inheritance of a different kind. The foundation began to attract attention. A small article appeared in the local newspaper, calling it "A Quiet Revolution in Ethical Empowerment." Then a regional nonprofit reached out, asking if I'd consider expanding the mentorship model to neighboring towns. For the first time in years, I felt the kind of excitement that wasn't about survival, but about creation. This was what healing looked like, not isolation, but integration. I started receiving letters, handwritten ones, from people I'd never met. One was from a woman who said she'd watched her own family fall apart over money and property. She wrote, "Your story reminded me that I can choose peace without surrendering my worth." I kept that letter on my desk, right next to the framed court order that had once symbolized victory. Now, both represented balance, the proof of what once was, and the promise of what could be. One afternoon, I hosted a small open session at the Foundation for Parents and Teens together. I watched as they sat side by side, discussing boundaries, communication, and how to disagree without disrespect. It was awkward at first, but then something shifted. They began to listen to one another. One father, his voice cracking, said, "I never realized how much my silence hurt my daughter." She reached out, and for a moment, they just held hands across the table. That simple act felt bigger than any legal win I'd ever had. As I drove home that night, the sun was dipping below the horizon, streaking the lake in pink and amber. I pulled into the driveway and paused to watch the reflection ripple across the water. The house, once a symbol of conflict, now looked peaceful again. I could almost imagine my father sitting on the porch, smiling quietly, as if to say, "You finally got it right." And maybe I did. Maybe justice wasn't about proving others wrong. Maybe it was about proving to yourself that you could rise, rebuild, and give back without bitterness. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when the letter arrived. I almost didn't notice it at first, tucked between the usual stack of bills and flyers, but the handwriting stopped me cold. It was elegant, practiced, and painfully familiar. My sister, Clara. For a moment, my hands hesitated over the envelope. It had been nearly 2 years since we'd last spoken, since the court order and the fallout that followed. I could still hear her voice from that day, sharp, defensive, wounded. And now, here it was again, distilled into ink on paper. I carried the letter to the porch, setting it on the table beside my tea. The lake was calm that afternoon, glassy and reflective, as though waiting for me to decide whether I was ready to open another chapter. I took a deep breath and unfolded the envelope. It wasn't a long letter. In fact, it was surprisingly simple. She started by saying she'd heard about the foundation through a mutual acquaintance, not the news, and that she wanted to acknowledge the good work. But as I read further, her tone softened. She admitted things I never thought she would. "I was angry because I thought Dad loved you more," she wrote. "I see now that what I mistook for favoritism was responsibility. He trusted you with things I didn't understand then. Maybe I still don't, but I wanted you to know that I see the difference now." I read that line over and over. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was something more honest, a small bridge extended across a deep chasm. She ended the letter with, "If you're open to it, I'd like to see the house again someday, just to sit by the lake. No business, no talk of inheritance, just time." For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel anger or suspicion, just a quiet, aching kind of relief. There had been a time when I fantasized about this moment, my sisters finally understanding the pain they caused, but I had never imagined it arriving so gently. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my father's old ledger, right between the pages about the dock repairs and his notes on shared family days. It felt right there, among the fragments of what once held us together. That evening, I walked down to the dock, the same one my father had built plank by plank. I sat at the edge, letting my feet dangle just above the water. I thought about what forgiveness meant now, not as a gift to others, but as freedom for myself. I didn't need to rewrite the past or pretend it hadn't hurt, but I could choose to stop letting it weigh me down. The sun began to dip, washing the lake in soft oranges and purples. I imagined what it might be like if Clara did visit again, 2 grown women sitting side by side in silence, not to rehash or justify, but simply to coexist. Maybe forgiveness didn't always come wrapped in words. Maybe sometimes it was enough to leave the door unlocked and the kettle warm. I stood up and walked back toward the house, feeling the crunch of gravel under my shoes. The porch light flicked on automatically, bathing the entrance in a golden glow. I paused, looked up at the sky, and whispered, "Thank you, Dad." Inside, I took out a blank card and began to write. "Clara, thank you for your letter. I'd like that. The lake misses you, too." I sealed it before I could overthink, placing it by the door to mail in the morning. It wasn't reconciliation yet, not fully, but it was a beginning. And after everything, that was enough. A few weeks later, spring arrived quietly at Walters Lake. The ice melted in slow, deliberate sheets, leaving the water glassy and blue again. Birds returned to the birches by the porch, and with them came a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time, renewal, uncomplicated and real. Life, I realized, has a way of finding balance when you stop trying to control every ripple. One morning, I sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise gild the surface of the lake. My phone buzzed beside me, a message from Clara, just a single line, "I'll be there around noon, if that's okay." For a moment, I just stared at the screen. My first instinct was to worry, to brace myself for the old tension that used to fill every room we shared. But then I took a deep breath and smiled. Yes, I thought, it's okay. When she arrived, she didn't pull into the driveway like she used to. Instead, she parked near the edge of the road and walked the rest of the way, her shoes crunching softly on the gravel. She looked smaller somehow, less sharp, more human. The wind tugged at her hair, and for a heartbeat, I saw the sister I used to know before money, pride, and fear had twisted us apart. "Hi," she said simply when she reached the porch. "Hi," I replied, my voice calm, steady. "Coffee." She nodded, and we sat together at the wooden table overlooking the lake. The silence between us wasn't awkward this time. It was patient, like an old wound that had finally stopped throbbing. For a while, we just listened to the waves brushing against the dock. Then she pulled something from her bag, a small photograph, worn at the corners. It was of the three of us, me, Clara, and Hannah, sitting on the edge of the dock as children, legs dangling in the water, our father behind us, grinning with that wide, unguarded joy. She placed it on the table and said quietly, "I found it while going through old boxes. I thought you should have it." I traced the edges of the photo with my fingertips, a lump forming in my throat. "We were happy then," I said. She nodded. "We were. I forgot what that felt like for a long time." We didn't talk much after that. There wasn't a grand apology or some emotional speech. Just the hum of nature, 2 cups of coffee cooling between us, and a shared understanding that forgiveness doesn't need an audience. When she left, she hugged me lightly, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to. As she walked back to her car, I stood on the porch and watched her go, feeling the strange mixture of sadness and gratitude that comes when you finally make peace with the past. Later that evening, I returned to my desk and placed the photograph beside my father's ledger. On one side lay the evidence of struggle, contracts, receipts, legal orders, and on the other a simple image of love before it all fractured. Together, they told the truth, that justice isn't about punishment but restoration, that boundaries don't end relationships, they redefine them, and that sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that heal generations. Before bed, I sat by the window once more, the lake glimmering beneath a pale moon. I thought about everything this home had witnessed, the laughter, the betrayal, the confrontation, the renewal. And I realized that every part of it mattered, even the pain, especially the pain, because without it, I wouldn't have learned the difference between being right and being whole. The next morning, I drafted the Foundation's new mission statement. It began simply, "For those reclaiming peace after conflict, for those who choose dignity over destruction." That sentence, I decided, would guide everything we did from now on. As I signed my name at the bottom, I felt a deep, quiet certainty settle inside me. The kind that doesn't need applause or validation, just peace. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and water through the open window. I closed my eyes and whispered softly to the still air, "We're home now, Dad. Finally home."